With me is Professor Agata Bielik-Robson, and she is working on the issue of studying finite life. Agata, first of all, you're very welcome. Why study finite life?
This is the project of my new book, and it is a working project, so I'm not yet fully sure about the outcomes.
Okay.
But the working title is Another Finitude, and the purpose of this book is actually to look at the idea of the finite life in modern philosophy, especially late modern 20th and 21st century, so it's a very contemporary thing, from a different perspective that it is done, or it was done, by the founding father of the so-called philosophy of finitude, that is Martin Heidegger. In a way, you can look at this book, and I'm looking at it that way, as a very strong polemic with Heidegger and the Heideggerian project. And I'm not talking here about Heidegger's involvement in the Nazi movement and his black books resurfacing recently. Although, obviously, I'm going to talk about this too. This anti-Heideggerian project is purely philosophical in the sense that I want to target Heidegger's definition of finite life as issuing towards death. The famous Sein zum Tode, being towards death, where human finitude, Endlichkeit, is being defined only from its perspective of its end, the moment of ending. So the limitation, the finite character of human existence, which is finite in time. It gets born, right? It is offered a certain amount of time, and then it dies, right? And there is no immortality. This kind of a perspective is on the finite life is only from the moment of death. So I call Heideggerian way of looking at the finite life as systematic overestimation of death. And now the problem is, why is it so interesting? I've always been interested in the idea of finite life, also from theological and religious perspective, because I'm not Christian. And from a non-Christian Jewish perspective, immortality, that is personal infinitude, is not a central issue of the belief. Putting things bluntly, I think that Judaism is originally, and I use originally in both senses of the word, that is from the origin, and it's also its sort of claim to originality. It's actually a religion of the finite life, not caring very much about the idea of immortality, or especially personal immortality. So it is the religion which is uniquely concerned with the question, is life before death possible, and not with the question, is life after death possible. If I were to define the difference between Judaism and Christianity, I would say that's precisely it. Existentially speaking, that's this difference. So, coming back to Heidegger, my idea is that if I draw from the sources of Judaism, if I look at the interesting Jewish philosophers of the 20th century, or even earlier, I will find an inspiration for another finitude. That is another version of post-Christian philosophy, which accepts the idea that human life is finite, doesn't go forever, you don't have immortal souls, but also is not fanatic. That is, it's not so focused on the issue of death, which also means it's not so pessimistic, it's not so depressing, right? It's not so thanatophilic, that is so death-bound and death-oriented. In other words, not so moribund. Heidegger himself, in Being in Time, tries to be cheerful and heroic, right? He wanted to show the finite life as issuing towards death, as actually resolute, full of mobilization, determination to live fully. And so was also Nietzsche before Heidegger. But My purpose is to show that this kind of healthy pessimism, as Nietzsche used to call it, is simply untenable. That if you indeed overemphasize the moment of death in the philosophy of finitude, you always end up rather demobilized and rather dying than living, right? That you will never find the proper measure of life before death, that in a way death invited to the center of your life will eat it up wholly. So what I'm doing by drawing on the sources of the alternative tradition, religion of a finite life, I'm looking at Jewish philosophers of the 20th century who I think offer another version of the finitude. Most of all Franz Rosenzweig, who's very often seen as the Heideggerian equivalent in Jewish existentialist philosophy, but I think it is rather unfair. He's not an equivalent. He's actually a polemist of Heidegger, especially on this issue. And another person, Hannah Arendt, who was Martin Heidegger's pupil and wrote a doctoral dissertation on Augustine with him. And already there, in this dissertation, we'll find very useful anti-Heideggerian ideas about how to approach the finite life. That is, not from the point of view of death, from the point of view of birth. This is when Hannah Arendt says that, okay, our lives are finite, but why do we focus on death? Why can't we rather focus on birth, natality? And this is how a conception of nativism is born. And I'm trying to show that both Rosenzweig and Arendt, when combined, actually give us a much more optimistic, healthy optimistic vision of a human finite life that ends with death, but does not overestimate death, and actually shows that love is as strong as death.
Agata, thank you for giving us this insight into your work in relation to Martin Heidegger and also into a different way of looking at life. Thank you.